Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sree's Global COVID-19 Show. My name is Sree Sreenivasan, and it's my honor to convene this conversation around various aspects of COVID-19 and the pandemic. Today is episode 266, Child Data Privacy. We're going to be meeting Veronica Barassi, author of the brand new Child Data Citizen, How Tech Companies Are Profiling Us from Before Birth. You can learn more about her book at childdatacitizen.com. You'll get a chance to ask her questions about various aspects of privacy and children. We're very excited to bring you this conversation, and you will meet her in just a minute. Hi, folks. I'm Sree. Thank you so much for being here. I'm the Marshall Loeb Visiting Professor of Digital Innovation at the Stony Brook School of Journalism and the co-founder of Digimentors, a social, digital, and virtual events consulting company. We'd love to talk to you about your virtual events. If you've got one coming up, we do webinars, conferences, summits. We've done events for 50 people and events for 100,000 people. We bet your events are somewhere in between. You can email me, or you can just go look us up at digimentors.group. We'd love to talk to you about working with you. Today, we are talking about child data privacy, but I do want to tell you a little bit more about the show and the archives, which you can find on youtube.com/Sreenet. We've had more than 450 guests from 20 countries, including the chief scientist of the World Health Organization. WHO is, of course, based in Switzerland, and our guest today is from Switzerland, and that's why we have a rare noon show, Eastern show, rather than the usual 9 p.m. Eastern show. I want to thank Scroll.in and Scroll Global for sharing our content. We are live on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And a big thanks to our producers, Rose Horowitz at Rose Horowitz 31, and Vandana Menon, Vandana_Menon. They're both tweeting the show, and so please follow them as well. And as always, thank you for watching, for making this an incredible experience these last 10, 11 months. March 14th is our anniversary of our first episode. And we went live every single day for 250 days and then moved to a once or twice weekly format. Thank you again for being here. And now let's talk about child data privacy. Our guest is Veronica Barassi, who's the author of Child Data Citizen, How Tech Companies Are Profiling Us from Before Birth. Folks, if you know someone who'd be interested in this topic, please tag them right now. They can watch live or later. The show will run on all of these platforms as soon as we're done. So anyone with children, anyone working with children should definitely watch. In this superb book, Barassi provides a rich and illuminating account of the way data about children is collected and used, why it matters, and what we can do about it. That's the review from Lina Dencik, the co-director of the Data Justice Lab. So everyone, please welcome onto our show our guest, Veronica Barassi. Hi, Veronica.
Hi, Sree.
Thank you so much for being here. My first question always is, where are you, how are you, and how's your family been handling the pandemic?
I am in Switzerland, actually. I live in Zurich, but we moved to Zurich on the 4th of March 2020 from Los Angeles. So it's been a big jump for my family. We are delighted to be here. It's nice. And I'm closer to my home, which I'm originally from Milan. So it's very close to Italy. And we're doing okay despite everything. We feel very lucky so far. So touch wood and everything. But yes, it's been a bit of a challenging year.
So just to understand, you are an Italian who lived in America till March 4th of 2020 and then moved to Switzerland. And so that must be quite the experience. Of those three countries, we've obviously seen that both Italy and New York and Los Angeles in America were the epicenters of this crisis. How has Switzerland been handling things?
Switzerland is handling things, I would say, in a kind of serious and relaxed way at the same time.
Serious and relaxed. Okay, that's unusual.
So there is, at the moment, we are in lockdown in the sense that all the shops are closed. The only shops that are open are pharmacies and supermarkets and a few real kind of necessity shops. So it's it's our new normal. We're gradually adapting to it. I felt very welcome since I arrived arriving in a new town and starting a new job and relocating in the middle of a pandemic has come with its challenges. So this is the situation.
Well, tell us a little bit about your background, and then we'll talk about the book.
So my background, I was born in Milan, and I moved to the UK in 2001 to study anthropology. And I'm an anthropologist. I got a PhD in anthropology. And I've been working on the anthropological impact of technologies. Especially at the beginning, I focused on social media technologies because obviously it was 2008, 2009, and that's what was happening then. But I started to become increasingly more concerned with the question of data technologies and the massive collection of data that was going on. And the way in which I started to become interested in this particular research focus was very personal, because I just had my first daughter, and I was writing my first book on social media and the data collection on social media and the rise of surveillance technologies. And what happened, obviously, when you write a book during maternity, it's a bit of a strange experience because you spend half of the morning trying to write and half of the morning dealing with other parents and eating cake and doing picnics and things like that. And what I started realizing, it was that all the parents around me were collecting and producing a lot of data of their children, and they were also sharing a lot of this data on social media. And that's when I started to increasingly become concerned about what was happening to the children and the fact that they were actually being datafied from birth, that we were seeing the very first generation of citizens that whose data was being collected from before they were born through pregnancy apps and then social media and so on. And I was interested in understanding what was happening to this data and what we were doing to our society, really.
And so the word you used was datafied, right? The first generation you said that was like this. And what are some examples? You gave a couple, but give us some more examples of how children are being datafied.
So when I started the project, the example that really struck my attention was the fact that a lot of parents were posting political information on social media. So they were basically showing their children at political rallies, sometimes with banners, sometimes there was like the odd joke going like against the government. And I, of course, come from Italy. And obviously, we have a history of an authoritarian regime in Italy. And so I started thinking, what would have happened if my own family, during the fascism, the family of my grandfather or the family of my grandmother started posting information of their children so young, that information was going to be a liability for children. That information would have been used to profile and politically profile children. Now, we know that the political profiling of people has always existed, and often really in relation to their family. But actually, the data that was being published online was very public. And so I started kind of questioning what was going on around these traces. And that's why I started coming to the conclusion that most of the data that we were producing was actually data that was not only consumer data, it was not only the data of children that, what type of activities they did or entertainment choices and things like that. It was actually data that related very much to their civic rights. And that's how I started to play with the idea of a datafied generation and the idea of datafied citizen.
And what has been the reaction to the book so far? And what have you learned in putting together the book?
Well, the book is, I try to write the book in a very personal way. It has some academic theory, but it is very about what happened basically to me. It was that I was living in London when I started working on the project. And I had my first daughter. And then my husband has been relocated to Los Angeles. And so we started to live in this kind of weird transatlantic family life in which we had a kind of a dual world. We had a house in London, we had a house in Los Angeles. I had to deal with, because I got pregnant for a second time in Los Angeles. So I had to deal with doctors in Los Angeles, and I had to deal with doctors in London. I had to deal with two education sectors. And so I started to analyze how the data environments around my children in both cities were developing, and how people were collecting my children's data. And so the book basically, and then I started to work with different families. So I worked with, I interviewed 50 parents, and I followed 8 families through the digital ethnography. But the product of basically the book came out more as a personal and really kind of real life experience account of what it means to raise children in the time of surveillance capitalism. And what it means, how do you deal with things? How do you deal with the fact that if you go to Disneyland, you get your child's facial recognition taken, and you ask for information, but they tell you, oh no, you have to. We don't have information to give you. We don't have a data policy. If you want, you can complain there, and then you have your little child who's dying to get into Disneyland, and so you're thinking, what am I doing? Am I really gonna fight this war or not? So this is all the examples that I use. I use a lot of examples taken from everyday life, and especially from the US context, but also from the UK context, and I combine that with the broader analysis of what happened. If you think about what happened in the health sector in the US as well as in the UK, you had over the last decades a datafication of the health sector. And so I look at the government policies and what happened really at political level, and how these transformations now are affecting us all.
All right. So we have lots of comments coming in, and then we will ask you for some tips on what parents can do. That'll be very helpful, and I know our audience would appreciate that. Let's see who's watching. Jonathan's watching from the East Village in New York. What's a favorite memory of yours about New York City? Veronica, yes.
My favorite memory of New York City?
Yes.
Well, I stayed in New York City when I was a child, and I remember the 14th Street in 1989. Coming from Milan, it was incredible. The variety, I remember the smell, I remember the bustly life of New York City, and it's a city that I really love, and it's part of my life in many ways. So yes, but I think that 14th Street in 1989 as an 8-year-old was a real experience, coming from Milan, which was tiny and small.
Milan's an amazing city, and when I was the chief digital officer of New York City, we went to Milan and we talked to my counterpart there and found so many ties between Milan and New York. I want to say hello to Jonathan, who has watched all 266 episodes of this show, which is incredible, and super grateful to him. Stefan says, very thankful to soak up this insight, especially with a teen in the house. Hope everyone is well. Thank you, Stefan. And everyone, Stefan has a fabulous show, and we'll tell you more about it a little bit later. And Apollo is watching from Montclair, New Jersey. Hi, Apollo. And here's someone from LA. Saludos from Los Angeles, California, Silicon Beach. Fernando, who was a guest on this show himself, talking about how LA has been keeping up with COVID. Sounds like, Veronica, by you leaving LA, you left at the right time, March 4th, 2020.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Neil, who's the executive producer of the New York Times Read Along, which is another show that we do. And my colleague at Digimentors, along with Stefan, says he can't watch live, but he and his wife Pam are going to watch later. They have a young daughter who was a guest on the show. We had a point of view of the pandemic from their daughter's point of view. My mom is watching from Kerala. Hi, Amma. Love you very much. Thank you for being here. And I don't know if you've been to India yourself, Veronica.
No,
so
I haven't. But I'm actually waiting for my PhD student who should be arriving from India in the next couple of weeks. So I hope a bit of India comes here soon. Yeah, so that's
very cool. Manuel's watching from Spain, and good to have you here. And Fernando says that surveillance capitalism, it's awesome to get that concept. So talk a little bit about that. What is surveillance capitalism?
So surveillance capitalism is a fantastic book to read. Is Shoshana Zuboff's book on which is called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And it's basically the idea that over the last 20 years, we witnessed an economic revolution of a sort in which we started as a society to become much more obsessed with data. So, according to Zuboff, what really triggered this, it was the discovery, and she believes it was Google to discover this, the discovery of behavioral surplus, of the idea that you could create added value from gathering data. Now, what I find fascinating when I think about surveillance capitalism is not only thinking that digital technologies have been transformed by this logic. You know, everything we do now online is constantly tracked, analyzed, it's used to profile us, it's then shared. But what really fascinates me as well is the fact that all the businesses and the everyday life around us has been pervaded by this logic. So it's not only online technologies that are gathering our data, it's our schools, it's our doctors, it's our playgroups, you know. And that's what I try to show in the Child Data Citizen book, is this idea that our everyday life has been completely transformed by surveillance capitalism. And there's some serious democratic issues that are emerging from this transformation. Especially when we're thinking about the amount of data that is being gathered of individuals from before birth and throughout their lives, and from different sectors of their life, and also the monopoly of this data. So we have big tech companies that are not only gathering data from our homes through home technologies, about our everyday interactions through social media, about our everyday uses of their services, right? They're not only doing that, but they're also buying health data out of apps or even through sharing agreements with the health sector. They are buying educational data or they're gathering educational data through the development of educational platforms. And so the concept of surveillance capitalism is really this idea that we have these big monopolies of data, and also we have a society that is entirely structured around the selling and buying and profiling, and we have very little control of this. So this is kind of the idea behind it.
So what can we do? It sounds like regular capitalism, you know, we have very little we can do to adjust to it. It's the life we live and the society we're in. What about surveillance capitalism? Where can we opt out? I remember the earliest discussions of digital privacy were around things like cookies, you know, back in 96, 97, 98. And we would say, well, we're not going to use online cookies. They're terrible. But then you couldn't use Amazon if you didn't allow cookies. And now everybody has them. So what are things that we can do, concrete things that we can do as parents, as grandparents, aunts and uncles, to take care of our children's privacy? To many of us, we feel like our own privacy is gone. But can we do something?
Well, first of all, I think that one of the key things that we need to understand is that it's no longer an issue of privacy anymore. So what we're actually fighting against is the right to self-representation, is the right of fair representation, is the right to non-discrimination. Because we're not only talking about technologies that surveil us, and we can say, you know, we have got nothing to hide. Well, why do I care if they know what I buy or things like that? That's no longer the issue. The issue at the moment is that as we are stepping into more AI-driven futures, in which AI technologies are going to be able to harness as much data of us that is out there, and then they use this data to create profiles and to make data-driven decisions about us, right? So the question is no longer a question of privacy. It's a really question about our everyday rights. And that's what I try to show in the Child Data Citizen book. It's a question about data justice and data rights. It's no longer only about privacy. Now, what we can do, and this is the tricky question, is I strongly believe that at the moment, we are seeing a shift in society's attitude towards these concepts and these ideas, especially because after the Cambridge Analytica, we have started to realize that actually these technologies are not only monitoring us, but they're profiling us. So they're trying to manipulate our behaviors, and they're making data-driven decisions about us. So what we can do at the moment is really to open up the debate, but not at individual level. But at collective level. So, for instance, if you are parents in a school and the teachers say, "Oh, it's inevitable for us to use this online platform," maybe you should have a conversation as PTA about the implications of using that online platform. What happened to that data, right? So one of the things that I suggest at the end of the book, obviously, I suggest a series of steps which I think should be taken in terms of policy making. But also I suggest to parents to really get together and start working together as businesses, as collectives, and as individuals to start analyzing and finding alternative solutions, right? This is then there are kind of concrete steps that in the day-to-day life they can be done. Like, for instance, if you're posting on social media, remember that this type of information is going to be used always to profile you or your children. And so be very careful about what you post. Try to put out there what you want to you know, like the best possible image, right? Because you don't want to be discriminated, you don't want to be misrepresented on the basis of that image. So be very careful about the data traces that you're living behind and that you're constructing, and the narratives that you're constructing for your children. And then privacy settings. There's increasingly more privacy settings that you could actually implement to prevent some forms of tracking. And again, have the conversation also with your children, talk and with the people around your children about how they share social media. If an app is free, or how they share information. If an app is free, think twice before downloading it. And so these are kind of my ideas. But obviously, it's not about individual choice anymore. It's a bit like climate change. I could turn off the light in my room, and I do, but I'm not gonna really make a difference by myself. So I think it's what we really need to realize is that when we deal with data rights, it is about the collective. It's about society, and we really need to step in.
Thank you. Vandana, one of our producers, says Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism is amazing. And Ruha Benjamin's work, Race After Technology, in which he goes into how inequality is coded into our tech, was also such an eye-opening read. So thank you, Vandana, for those comments. And I'm sure that Veronica would endorse those. So for those of you just joining us, we are talking to the author, Veronica Barassi, who is the author of this book, Child Data Citizen, How Tech Companies Are Profiling Us from Before Birth. And please check out her Twitter feed, which is at Veronica Barassi, and her website, childdatacitizen.com. All kinds of studies and links, and it's like a blog and so much more that you can find at childdatacitizen.com. And give us some examples, please, of what tech companies are doing to profit and profit from us by profiling us from even before birth.
So basically, what we are seeing, one thing that I discuss in the Child Data Citizen book is the idea of personal data. You know, most of our debates about the data that is being collected, they all evolve around the idea of personal data, right? But we're not, the concept of personal data is very limited, and we cannot really use it as a big umbrella term. And what I show in the book is actually that we need to talk about different types of data. We need to talk about social media data. We need to talk about health data. We need to talk about education data. And we need to talk about what I define as home life data, okay? So, and I think that once we start breaking down all these different types of data, what we actually see is, again, a monopoly of big tech companies, which are trying to harvest all these different types of data. And the other thing that is particularly scary about this harvesting of different types of data in different spheres of social life is the fact that these companies have the means to aggregate all this data under unique ID profiles. So you're talking about companies that actually have used facial recognition technologies, and other types of biometric data. So they can re-identify all this different data to one single user, okay? And that is in itself problematic. Now, another thing that is happening that is really problematic is the fact that there is a lot of companies that are tapping into household profiling. One of the key features of profiling, as we all know, is that you're not being profiled for who you are. It's not only about your behaviors on that. We're not being profiled because I, Veronica Barassi, have done that click and that's it, right? It's not as simple as that. I'm being profiled according to the group that I belong, to the family that I belong, to the ethnicity that I belong, to the class that I belong. So I'm being profiled in terms as a collective. And that in itself is extraordinarily problematic because it can stall social mobility and it can really lock people into specific stereotypes. Now, don't get me wrong, profiling on the basis of your ethnicity, your religion, politics has always been there. But what we're seeing now is technologies that are doing that, and they are presenting this as if it was objective, as this was the reality. And also, the other thing that's happening is the fact that we are seeing these. We do not have any control over this profiling because most of these technologies are not transparent and they're not accountable. So that's why at the moment, and there's millions of not millions, but there's a lot of really, really interesting research emerging at the moment on this. But that's why at the moment we're talking about an amplification of social inequalities, because these technologies are actually amplifying those inequalities that were already there. Okay, but what's so scary about it is that they're presenting as if they are objective, because data is objective, because quantitative readings are objective, and this is something that we really need to be wary of.
Yeah, I worry about this in so many ways, because once this data is captured, it's just there and can be used in so many different ways. Fernando asks, are there examples of where the collection of all this data is beneficial? And we talked about so much of the negative sides of this. So what are some examples of child data that has been used for good?
More personalized health, like that's something that is a very, like if you think about in AI innovation in healthcare and more precise forms of treatment, that's phenomenal. Those are phenomenal advances. You have phenomenal advances also when you think about fighting climate change, or like that. But that's why we have to be really clear that we are not going against the technologies per se. What we are actually questioning is whether these technologies can understand human beings. What happens when these technologies are used to profile human beings and make decisions about their civic rights? So, and this is an example that I often make, right? So say, for instance, you have an AI technology that deals with health and a specific disease in children, right? So you have a lot of data, you have a lot of personal data. You realize that some of that data is biased. You realize that some of that data is not correct. You rectify it. You add more data, and you kind of try to be more precise, right? You try to have a more precise outcome, right? So you're never really going to fix it, but you can improve it in a substantial way. When we're talking about human profiling and AI technologies profiling humans, the trick doesn't work. One, because most of our data traces are not the mirror of who we are. My data traces are so messy. Like at the moment, I am constantly Googling about early motherhood because my sister just had a baby. And I'm being profiled as a new mother. Yeah, I know. So, but this is the thing. So there's so much errors in the way in which algorithms understand humans, because human experience is just much more complex than a mathematical deduction. And so to go back to your question, yes, there are some really good. There's some really good use out there of these technologies, and that could really change the world for the better. But we have to question whether we can use these technologies for profiling humans and making data-driven decisions about that. This is something that I'm really, really keen on understanding. And at the moment, I'm launching a new project, which is called the Human Error Project, which is precisely talks about how these technologies have an intrinsic. We rely on these technologies because we think that they go against the human error, but actually they have a human error inside of them because it's very difficult to read humans, and algorithmic deductions cannot read the humans. Humans are much more complex than that.
All right. Fernando says amen. So you've got somebody who agrees with you. Apollo says, what about the use of web data in legal questions? Does profiling emerge there? Are you seeing that that's happening?
Well, are you talking about the algorithmic use in justice settings?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, you can interpret this any way you like, but also, are you seeing court cases where things are being, we've seen on a much more simple level, we have seen cases of criminal cases brought on by Google searches by fathers who are trying to kill their children for whatever reason, or examples like that. So how are you seeing kind of this data being collected and being used?
Actually, it depends, because at the moment, there's so much research out there that is fascinating in this regard.
Apollo says also what things people search.
On what things people search, so whether the search history is being used for legal for legal. I haven't come across much of that. I've come across a lot of well, not a lot, but we're seeing at the moment court cases and issues like, for instance, I think it was in New York recently that it was the first time that someone was being jailed because of a wrong facial recognition match. So he was wrongly profiled and it's been jailed. So I've seen that. I know one thing that I always tell my students and everyone that I talk to, one thing that we have to remember always, is that most of these technologies of data tracking and data recording, they say in their privacy policies, and they're very clear about it, that if requested, they're going to give up the data for legal reasons, right? And they often say that. And one thing that terrifies me about that is, for instance, the errors and the missteps that could happen. Imagine that you are in a home and you say, "Oh, I would like to kill someone," or you say something like that. How would that potentially be something that could be used against you? We don't know yet. Obviously, this is a bit dystopian, but still, we are kind of seeing a lot of this new use of data by the law and law enforcement, which could be problematic. And with web searches, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. Like in the UK. I think it was 2000. I might be wrong on this. I think it was 2012. And it was, I think it was called the Snooper. It was actually the nickname was the Snooper bill, but it was a bill introduced by Theresa May that was actually aimed at making sure that all the telephone companies or the internet companies would store your data for over a year, so that enforcers could access that data if there was ill doing or something like that. So all these things are happening around us. So then we have to be aware of them. But I hope it answered the question there.
Sure. We only have a few minutes left. Let's look at some of the other comments that have come in. Stefan says, one of the things I'm teaching my students at FIT is to always be aware that everything they do forms their digital thumbprint or profile. There is nothing more important than thinking twice about everything we post, written and visual data. And he tells them to Google themselves to see what is out there. I would add, obviously, even things you search and even the way you use your apps, it's not that you have to post something for a digital trail, right? It's even in your searches and what you looked at and what you did on there. It doesn't even have to be that kind of positively posting something to have an impact.
Absolutely. Actually, Stefan, that's very funny that you mentioned that, because I do that with my students too. And it was like, I think last term, at a certain point, my students Googled me. And because I said, oh, Google yourself as an exercise in class and then talk about your findings. And they Googled me. And they said, oh, Veronica, and I found this thing on Instagram, and I remember that I froze, and I was like, oh my gosh, what did you find? And then it was nothing, but it was very funny, because it really makes you, it makes you think, what have I done wrong? And this is something that something that we need to bear in mind. No matter how much data companies collect about us, it doesn't mean that this data is actually accurate. The majority of this data is maybe it's dated, maybe it's misconstrued, maybe we search something for someone else, So all these things, we really need to, and we can control a little bit our digital footprint. But at the moment, there's very little regulation on data brokers, and there is very little regulation of what happens behind the scenes. And I don't know what data they have been able to track, or which data they use to profile me, and then they maybe send it to my HR or to or things like that. So you're actually talking about, that's why I talk about the child data citizen in the context of surveillance capitalism, because there is that world behind us that we really need to step up and do something about it, because it could have serious implications, especially if we are stepping into more AI-driven societies.
Sure. And this is the comment from Apollo, who says, thank you. That was a great answer. And before we come to you for some final thoughts from our guest, Veronica, I want to just remind folks of a couple of the other shows we do. And of course, to tell you about this program that Stefan's running on Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern with Bob Kendrick, the president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City. He was a guest on our show a few months ago, and he's a terrific guest, and you will learn so much as they look through all these amazing pictures that are in the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. So 10 p.m. Eastern time. I think Veronica will be asleep at the time because she's in Switzerland. That's why we're on earlier ourselves today, but you can certainly check out the recording. We also want to tell you about our friends who run She's on Call, the show that's run by our surgeon friends, Sujana Chandrasekhar and Marina Kurian. They have a great Valentine's Day episode that ran last week, but this time they have an episode with two experts, and you will learn a lot from joining these physicians and watching this. So She's on Call on all the platforms. And one last plug here before we go back to our guest is the Sunday New York Times read along, 8:30 a.m. Eastern time. We read the Sunday New York Times out loud. Here are some of our recent guests, but this coming Sunday at 8:30 a.m. Eastern is Elizabeth Becker, author of You Don't Belong Here, How Three Women Rewrote the Story of War, and she's a former New York Times correspondent herself. All right, so with that, let's go back to Veronica and get her final thoughts and suggestions for the parents, grandparents, uncles, and aunts who are watching right now.
Well, I think, to be honest, what I think is happening at the moment is that we are dealing with a very different world, right? And especially also with the pandemic, most of the topics that I discussed in the Child Data Citizens have not only increased, but they've been amplified incredibly by the pandemic, because most of our lives have moved online. That's we go online to connect, to work, to socialize, to do almost everything these days. So what I think we need to remember is that we are still negotiating the risks of these technologies, right? The AI innovation is going fast, and the race for AI innovation is going particularly fast. But every time that a new technology comes, it comes also with specific problems. And this is not to say that, oh, we're going to be conquered by robots, or we're actually going to see everything automated, and it might be, but I don't think that's the problem. What I think is that we need to understand these technologies a little bit as the earlier forms of airplane. I wouldn't fly on an airplane in 1914. I don't know you guys, but I would feel not really secure. But I do fly, well, not in pandemic times, but I do fly very, very often right now. So what I think we need to do, and really, is to work together as a society to make these technologies safer for us, and safer for our democratic values. And I think this is a paramount things that we have to work together to do. And one way in which we could do this is to really start thinking about the new generations, and the fact that we are datafying, that we are using their data and in ways, and we're profiling them from before birth. Today, it came out that an AI is being used to study the emotions of children online, and to target them with personalized learning. I mean, that's the logic of that all things to me is terrifying. One, because if I had been targeted with personalized learning during my education, I wouldn't have been exposed to mathematics or many other things, because I wasn't interested. I was not even particularly good at it. But this is the thing. Education is about knowledge, is about openness. It's not about stereotyping and locking children in stereotypes to try to mitigate or preempt potential risks, right? Because this is not a healthy and democratic society if you do that from the start. So I think that as parents and as grandparents, as business leaders, we do have a responsibility for future generations. And I think that we need to act now. So, yeah.
Stefan says, thank you, and I look forward to learning more about you and your work. Fernando asked a question that we don't have time for the full answer, but do you feel like Republicans and Democrats are working on this issue as a bipartisan way, or is this lost in all the conversation around big tech and things like that?
Oh, I love American politics. I really do. It has entertained me for quite some time in joking this. But yes, anytime. I think that in general, in the States and beyond, there is a much better awareness of what's going on. I think that in the States, you do have a problem that most of there's a lot of lobbying going on. There is a lot of work behind the scenes in terms of data protection, and which in Europe, for instance, is not as extended. So I think that that's one of the issues that at political level, people are gonna have to deal with. But also, what I really think that one of the problems in politics is this is that there seems to be a very lack of understanding of these issues, and that when that's emergent, for instance, in the interview to Mark Zuckerberg in 2018 after the Cambridge Analytica, when he had to report back, he was like, most of the questions that were asked were a bit out of focus. I remember watching it live and thinking, no, please don't ask that. So I think that at political level, there is really still a lot of work to be done to create a growing awareness. And so I think that, and that should be the first step, really, rather than thinking about the divisions between Republicans or Democrats. But I think that the very first step to be done is to educate the political elite at the moment, and actually really. But I think, having said that, I think that there's been massive increasing interest in this. And I think that all those political steps are necessary and are really, really very welcome.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Fernando says, thank you for an eye-opening show. And Jonathan says, provocative and insightful show. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for watching. And a big thanks to Veronica. Everyone, please check out her book, Child Data Citizen, and check out her website, childdataCitizen.com. And thank you all for being here. And please send us feedback as always. My email is sree@sree.net. Would love to hear from you, or you can tweet us @Sree, and you can tag a friend, anyone who would be interested in this topic. Just tag them. They can watch live on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn as soon as we're off the air from this. Thanks very much, everyone.